Welcome. My name is John Kittmer. This is the first of the Anglo-Hellenic League's webinars. It's great to welcome you here this evening. I'm told that we have over 150 registrations, so I hope most of you have made it, and it's great to have you virtually with us this evening. If you haven't come across us before, let me just tell you a little bit about the Anglo-Hellenic League. We are a charity based in London. We've been in existence since 1913. We exist to promote friendship and understanding between Britons and Greeks, between Britain and Hellenism, whether that's in Greece or in Cyprus or in the worldwide diaspora. We raise money for the relief of poverty and social exclusion in Greece and the UK, and we put on a cultural programme of events rather like this, including the Runciman Award, which is our flagship book prize that is given every year in June. Like most charities, our programme has been massively disrupted by the pandemic, and like again, many charities, we've decided to come onto webinar. This is the first webinar that we've done. So you, the audience, are our guinea pigs, and we're also rather guinea pigs to each other as well. My guess is that some of you won't have used webinar before. So let me just, before we get going for real, let me just tell you a little bit about how webinar is going to work this evening. Let me first start by reassuring you that we can't see or hear you, the audience. You will be able to see us as we speak, I hope. You will also be able to communicate with us using the Q&A box, which you can find on your screen by clicking on Q&A. This is a text service. You can send Polly questions, which we will group for answer towards the end of the hour-long session. I have a colleague called Dimitris who is going to help me group your questions as they come in so that we can continue the conversation that Polly and I are going to have together, inviting you, the audience, in. We have disabled chat this evening and disabled the hands up. So the only way that you can communicate with us, because we wanted to keep it simple, is by sending us questions. If it's the sort of question that is a technical question, we'll try and answer it in real time and you'll see the answer come up. But if it's a question for Polly at the end, be patient. We will come to your questions in the last 15-20 minutes or so of the evening. Now, before we get going, let me just tell you about our next event, which will be on next Wednesday, the 4th of November, also at 7 o'clock. The author, Michael Cullen, is going to give us an illustrated talk about the Peloponnesian Way. This is a fantastic walking path that starts in the south of the Peloponnese at Kardamili and goes across the spine of the peninsula all the way to Diakopto in the north. Michael has written the great guidebook to this walk, and he's going to take us through it. If you haven't signed for that yet, please register. You'll find the registration details on our website, which I will give you the address of towards the end of the talk. But tonight, it's a great pleasure to have with us Polly Samson as our guest and speaker. I'm really delighted that Polly is able to join us. Many of you will know her already, but for those of you who don't, Polly is a journalist, a creative writer, a lyric writer, but also the writer of 2 published volumes of short stories and 2 previous novels. But we've invited her to talk to us this evening, principally because of this fantastic novel, A Theatre for Dreamers, which came out just as the COVID curtain sort of closed down on us all. The novel, I think, is a dazzling, really dazzling reimagination of the bohemian set of writers and artists that were active and present on the island of Hydra in Greece between the mid-50s and the mid-1960s. We're going to reveal the book to those of you who haven't yet read it through some readings, and also we're going to have a chat. Polly, you're really, really welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. It's so lovely to be here. Thank you. And hello, everybody out there on the webinar.
Fantastic. It is a real pleasure at this time to be able to continue with talks with authors. So thank you for being a sport and for trying it this way. Now we're going to start, we're going to split the conversation into 3 chunks. We thought we would have 3 different readings by Polly showing different aspects of this really rich and complex in different ways book. I will hand over to you, Polly, to start with the first bit, the first chunk.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so the protagonist of this book is called Erica, and she's English, and she has gone to the island, and she has really gone to seek a writer who's living there called Charmian Clift, who might be able to help her with some mysteries about her own life. And this is a section that John has kindly chosen for me to read that illustrates something about her early life on the island. It's Wednesday, my day to cook, and Charmian has already haggled on my behalf at the vegetable boat, picked out every bean and onion with poignant care, putting tomatoes to her face for their scent, accepting quarters of oranges from the boatman with a childlike pleasure. Nobody speaks English. She teaches me Signomi, Kyrie, and Pozokani afto? Excuse me, and how much? In my basket are 8 glossy aubergines, a vegetable I've never met before. Charmian has promised to teach me to make moussaka. I need to pin her down to a time, preferably when I can get her alone to talk about Mum. People keep getting in the way. When she isn't slaving with George or drinking with this crowd, her children devour her. It's noon and the foreign community gathers around her and George outside the store, awaiting Fortune's sunny smile. The mail arrives on the same boat as visitors, and today is just the sort of day that a Czech might choose to sail in on. The sight of so many writers is not an enticement to join their ranks. Dishevelled and miserable are 2 words that spring to mind. The American novelist Gordon Merrick has come down from the hills sporting a black eye. He and Chuck have a taste for young sailor boys, Charmian whispers. Sometimes things go wrong. George has shredded several matchsticks and with nicotine fingers is building a little pyramid out of them on the table. The Norwegian Axel Jensen has sores on his lips and trousers worn so thin they are indecent at his splayed crotch. Patrick Greer is pointing and wagging his schoolmaster's finger to win some point or other. One of these days that finger will go off bang, Charmian mutters, and Nancy, Patrick's wife, a bountiful Mrs. Spratt to his Jack, hears her and laughs. Jean-Claude Maurice sits across the aisle with the sun glinting on his hair, his back to everyone but Trudy, the pretty red-haired art student we met in Athens, who is ever hopeful of being reunited with her lost luggage. Axel Jensen nervously bolts a coffee. The girl in the red shorts leans over her sketchbook, one bare foot crossed to her knee. Her hair falls in a sleek, shiny curtain. Her arms are slim as flutes. She's busy ignoring everyone, shading with a pencil, another between her teeth. Axel Jensen watches her. Jimmy, my boyfriend, does too. Cats lays on warm rocks. The harbour is flat as a mirror. The Easter bunting has been spirited away. Fishing nets are laid out for mending. Donkeys carry bales of dried sponges from the factory to the dock. The butcher walks past in his bloody apron. Though it has only been a fortnight since my arrival, this girl with her basket of shiny aubergines feels like she's part of the island's welcoming committee as the Canadian poet disembarks. He arrives in the port unhurried in soft soles, looking around and smiling at everything he sees, like someone returning home from a long journey. He looks easy in his clothes, wears a cap and sunglasses, carries a green typewriter and a smart leather suitcase, a guitar strapped to his back. Janie and Edie skip beside him in tight pedal pushers and striped sailor shirts, clearly ecstatic to have met such an interesting new friend on the boat back from Athens.
So fantastic.
Thank you.
A great introduction to the novel. So here, a Canadian poet, the name of whom we all know, arrives for the first time on the island of Hydra. We all can remember our first time on the island of Hydra. When did you arrive for the first time, Polly? What's your experience of Greece and this particular island?
So my first time on Hydra was in May 2014, and it was a half-term holiday. And one of those, it's really hard to find somewhere to go with a bunch of your children where the sun is almost guaranteed to shine and where there'll be lovely swimming. And a friend of mine called Rosie Boycott said, "Oh, you must go to Hydra. It's fabulous." So really on a whim, we sort of booked a house and we all went and we took a load of friends. It was it was an old captain's house, so there was room for friends. And we had a really lovely week, but I didn't really know that much about it. I don't think I even knew that it was Leonard Cohen's island. Although I was a huge fan, I have no memory of sort of going and finding his house at that point. But one thing that happened was that in the house we rented was a copy of Peel Me a Lotus, this book, by Charmian Clift, and it just hit me like an arrow in the heart, and so I knew I had to go back and find out more, and then when we were back in England, I researched the writer and I realized that she was someone who was just going to haunt me, so that was the first time. That's
really interesting, because I think all of us who've read the book realize that the character that you're first and foremost interested in is Charmian herself, but she is your point of entry into Hydra.
Yes, and photography is something that I love, but when I look back at my photographs of that first trip, they were very, very sort of concentrated. I mean, that book had a huge impact because, her house is still there. It's very easy to find it. The first sentence of her memoir of Hydra is, "Today we bought the house by the well." And, it's a few steps up from the port. There it is. There is the bougainvillea that she planted, which is the most wonderful bougainvillea on the whole of Hydra. And yes, and so my first trip there, on the last day, I sort of went to find her house and photographed my daughter as a little girl in front of this house. And my daughter is now 18, and I've been working on the book ever since.
Fantastic. This is, of course, as you describe really well, a community of artists and writers changing all the time. If I remember right, Clift and Johnston arrived in the mid-50s.
They arrived in 1950, in the winter of 1955. They'd been in London. They were an Australian writing couple, and they had been in London for 5 years, where George Johnston was running a press agency in London, and they longed to go to an island where they could just be two things really. They could write, but the other thing that was very important to Clift was that her children could have a very free childhood, running around, not the constricted life that she saw them having in London, where they weren't allowed to climb a tree. There was nowhere for them to swim. That she'd had quite a wild childhood herself. And so they went, first of all, to Kalymnos to write a novel about, they collaborated, and it was the third novel they'd collaborated on, and they went to write a novel about the dying sponge industry. Kalymnos was the greatest sponge island, and so of course was having the greatest problem as synthetic sponges took over the industry. But Hydra was also, that was a huge part of Hydra as well, was the sponge industry. So they spent a year on Kalymnos, which was very, very wild, very basic. And after a year, they had written the novel that they set out to write. She had also written her first solo book, which is a wonderful memoir of their first year in Greece, called Mermaid Singing, which is about that year on Kalymnos. And then really they just needed to be somewhere with a little bit closer to civilization. If, you know, Athens being, you know, in those days, a 3-hour steamer ride from Hydra, but it felt like somewhere that they could put down roots. And so they then moved to Hydra, and they very quickly bought a house with every last penny they had. And it was an incredibly brave thing to do, because she was at this point pregnant with her 3rd child. And they had no money for, you know, if anything went wrong, they had no money to get her off the island, to get her to a hospital. She just, you know, they just left, they just had great confidence that everything would be all right. And indeed it was.
And were they looking, Polly, to create a community around them, or were they doing the opposite and trying to escape other writers?
The opposite. They were horrified by what happened, because when they arrived, I mean, they often said they created a myth around themselves. Really, they would always say we were the first foreigners to buy a house on Hydra. Well, they weren't. They may have been the second foreigners to buy a house on Hydra, but the first were a couple called rather wonderful couple called Christian Heidsieck, who was the scion to the champagne company, and his wife, who was a sort of Bohemian Russian. And they'd bought a house in Kamini, which their family still has. But they were the second. And when they were first there, during that first winter, they had encouraged their friends, the painter Sidney Nolan and his wife Cynthia, to come there. And there were 1 or 2 foreigners. So they became very close, this little group, but it was a tiny group.
And Nolan, I think, stayed with the great Greek painter Gikas, whose house was still intact at that time.
Only just yes, it had another year before it. Well, no, actually, at that point, 1955, it had another 6 years.
A few years.
But Gika, I think, only, you know, didn't go to Hydra very much at that point. Life in Hydra had been sort of before that, and which is why Sidney Nolan got to have the house, and other artists would often have the house, the use of the house. And then what happened was that in 1956, the film Boy on a Dolphin was made and filmed on Hydra with an 18-year-old Sophia Loren.
Wow. And
this was a huge event and a huge Hollywood film. And from that point, more and more people started to arrive. And, you know, Marianne Eland and Axel Jensen, the Norwegian writer, Marianne, who is, of course, the subject of So Long, Marianne, and became Leonard Cohen's sort of, he referred to her as his first wife, his young wife. They arrived, and they arrived very much because they had seen this film, this wonderful film. I mean, it's kind of shows the island off in the most fabulous way. And then other people arrived. A lot of Scandinavians in the early days.
And the community very swiftly developed a reputation, didn't it? So it tended to grow and grow for the best part of a decade. I think it was really strong, wasn't it?
Yes, it did. I mean, word got out, and you know, Charmian and George were known as the king and queen because they were very generous with their knowledge and very generous with their time, and they were very sociable. Although they worked incredibly hard. They wrote 14 books between them in the decade that they were in Greece, which is amazing, really. And so people would arrive and they would help them to find a house and tell them the best chemical to use to stop the lavatory from stinking, or the best, you know, where to buy their kerosene or how to get ice. And, you know, they sort of fostered the community, although I think it grew far too fast and far too big for their own comfort. They longed for another island. You know, they wished people would find their own. They felt that it belonged to them in some way, and they wished that people would go somewhere else. But, you know, by 1964, with the drug culture and the hippie culture, it became not a lot of people were there working as hard as George Johnson and Charmian Cliff. There were a lot of people partying and kind of tending to work and not really working, and it became you know, the center of youth culture because it had an offshoot of the Athens Art School in one of the mansions, And so there would be a lot of, artists could get a very, very cheap room. They just had to take a portfolio and show that they were, they had some sort of ability, and they would be able to stay for, a pittance. So yes, it became overrun with the foreign community a few years later. Yeah.
Other than the group of British youngsters that you invent and introduce onto the island, you concentrate, of course, on the writers and the artists. And I think it's fair to say you show them to be a kind of warts and all community. I mean, yes, they're very creative, but they're also astonishingly bitchy. And I recall a actually quite horrifying scene that you recount, where they're talking about Marianne. And
yes.
So you have a fairly complex notion of this community.
Yes. Well, I was very lucky because so many of them were writers, and they left a lot of writing. There were unpublished novels and published novels. And, there was a New Zealand writer who's in the book, called Bim Wallace, who left many versions of the novel he was trying to write about the community. Axel Jensen wrote a novel based on them in 1960, which actually has never been published in England. Of course, George and Charmian wrote about it extensively. And so, yes, picking through all of those things, and also, lots of letters. And I mean, it was a labyrinthine research job, actually, but that is what came through, is how much they bitched about each other, because that's what happens if you're stuck. They were stuck. They were on this island, and a lot of them didn't have the cash to even go to Athens. They were desperate for a royalty check, for any sort of good news, because they were just stuck with each other, and they all drank a lot.
I think you depict them as well as being actually not all of them. It's clear that Johnston and Clift are pretty well integrated. They know quite a lot of the Greeks. The photographs by James Burke show this, that they knew Gekas very well, of course. But the community feels a bit like a colony, as you describe it, because they're very self-contained. They look to their own relationships, their own problems, not so much of a set of contacts with Greeks. Is that what you discovered in the research, or is that just the way in which you wanted to put the fiction together?
No, that is very much from the research, because none of these people spoke Greek. And so that, and in tourism, I mean, now, anyone on an island like Hydra speaks English because of Hollywood and because of tourism, and, and people learn English. But then nobody on the island really spoke English, apart from the brothers who had the store, the Katsikas brothers. So it put a natural barrier between the native islanders and the incomers, that those who spoke English sort of gathered together, and the Greek islanders didn't. And so that meant that there was a division, which was a shame, really.
Yeah, it certainly isn't a community of social anthropologists. They're not all there as others were, really trying to live with the communities and understand them.
No, they just wanted cheap rent, sunshine, a group of people to party with. A lot of them had the pretension of wanting to work. Some of them genuinely worked. But I think really it was about living somewhere incredibly beautiful, and there were a lot of available houses because of the way that Hydra had sort of grown and then shrunk again through poverty and then sort of flourishing at various points, and then becoming very, very, very poor. There were, immensely beautiful houses to rent for a pittance. Food was good, food was cheap, and booze was cheap. They all talk about this, about the price of cigarettes, the price of Retsina. They could have everything they wanted for a year, in what it would cost them for a bedsit for a few weeks in the towns that they were coming from. And word spread, and they gathered. I mean, it became huge, this community. And there was poor old Charmian and George, who really were trying to work. It became impossible.
Yes, and I think the way in which you convey the sense of the party party atmosphere is really skillful, if I may say so. I mean, it can be boring reading about other people's parties, but you inject real life into the hangovers and the parties themselves. The dialogue is really convincing. Let's turn to your main character, to Charmian herself, and we've chosen a passage which I think shows her and the relationship that I think is really interesting that you develop in the novel. Shall we turn to the book again?
Thank you. So in this part, Erica, my protagonist, has gone to the beautiful cemetery on Hydra with Charmian. Do you feel ghosts, Charmian? Oh yes, she replies, and she sighs long and hard. I have ghosts, not all of them dead. What do you mean? She opens her mouth to say something, stops. I feel her change tack. It's a strange thing when you miss someone who is there, she says, and she looks down at the sponge diver's grave as sadly as if he were her own son. There, but not there, right before you all the time. Like George, by which I mean the George I married, with his tremendous verve and unbroken spirit. She tells me it can't have escaped my notice that things are not right between them. Says how awful she feels for the children having to witness their fights. I should have put my foot down about that wretched novel of his. You know, I shan't read it, I say, making a cutting motion at my throat and giving her my Girl's Guide honour, which at least makes her laugh. But if it's embarrassing for you, why has he done it? To understand George, you have to know something of his childhood in Australia. A fragile boy, bookish, rather artistic in temperament, the opposite of his beefy brother Jack. His father was a brute with the razor strop, savage beatings, and never for something naughty he'd done. That was the thing, but just in case there was some misdemeanour that he wasn't admitting to. Can you imagine what that does to a sensitive little boy? The saddest thing is he's become like his old man. Now his leaping time is behind him. It's buried so deep in him, there's nothing he can do. He suspects me and imagines all sorts of bullshit things, and he thinks he should punish me. She manages a rueful smile. You know, just in case. Closer to the sun is a difficult one. There's often a green-eyed nymphomaniac stirring up the troops in George's books. Again, the rueful smile. But this is the first time he's written from within his own skin. An Aussie writer, a former war correspondent, a wife and a family on a Greek island. No doubt people are going to read it as though it were the truth, memoir if you like, and not some twisted product of his poor, tortured imagination. I've been silent, but can't help myself. Hang on, what about Jean-Claude? I daren't look at her once the words are out. Really, Erica, you're just as bad as the rest of the mongrels. She stamps her foot. And if you must know, Jean-Claude Maurice does not merit the literary attention that's been lavished upon him.
So a huge amount going on in just a page and a half, and I think it gets to the that passage gets to the heart of a number of the currents that you're developing in the novel. Let's look first. So as you've said, Clift and Johnston are seen as the king and the queen of the island. As across history, kings and queens have relationships of their own to manage, and this relationship, I think, in my reading of it, is at the core of your novel. Could you just tell us a bit more about how you see this? It was clearly tempestuous.
Yes, you know, one of the things about it is that there's been a lot of debate. I mean, there've been biographies. There was a biography of George, first of all, written by a very good Australian academic, that really kind of pointed the finger at Charmian and sort of held her responsible for his ill health. He died from tuberculosis in 1970, and Charmian tragically committed suicide in 1969. So they are often sort of seen as the sort of Ted and Sylvia of Australia. It's a sort of terribly sort of tragic trajectory, you know, how they got to that point. But the problem really was one of, well, they had no money. They were working terribly hard. They were trapped. They didn't have, you know, when they first wanted to go and live on a Greek island, it wasn't with the idea that they would never even be able to afford to go to Athens. I mean, they really were living from hand to mouth, from royalty statement to royalty statement. And, you know, George became progressively more and more ill, and eventually in 1959 was diagnosed with TB, and the drugs made him impotent. He was 11 years older than Charmian, who was a sort of vivacious, beautiful, I mean, you know, really, I mean, that's actually a terribly work-worn picture of her, but she was a ravishingly beautiful and vital woman. And he was terrifically ill. He was impotent. This sort of world was going on, you know, full of beautiful young poets and painters. And, you know, she was still in her mid-30s living with this man, you know, who was impotent and was also incredibly jealous. It was a tinderbox, actually, and they both drank too much, and they had very, very public fights. And, you know, there's a sort of debate really between all sorts of people who write about them and have written biographies as to whether they hated each other or loved each other. And that was really important for me to sort of to try and work that out. And I was incredibly lucky towards the end of writing this book, because I decided that actually they were passionate about each other.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine in London was a friend of Thomas Keneally, and she was talking to him, and she'd read my novel, and she was talking to him about it, and he said, "Oh, I knew them because what happened was after Hydra, they went back to Sydney, and they survived for George survived for 5 years, and she survived for 4 years." And my friend said, "Oh, would you meet this person who's written this book?" And my big question for Thomas Keneally was, did they love each other? And he said, absolutely yes. And that was kind of what I wanted to hear, because it meant that I had actually reached the right conclusion. And he'd spent time with them when he was a young writer, and they would encourage him and have him around to their flat. So he spent a fair bit of time with them in their latter years. And so, yes, it was a complicated relationship. She was very much supporting him in everything he wrote. He was someone who needed a sounding board. She was a very private writer. He was someone who needed a sounding board. He couldn't, by the end, it seemed he couldn't really write without her sort of sitting right next to him. Mm-hmm. So he really did take all the oxygen. And she got very little time to write her own books. Mm-hmm. She, in her lifetime as a solo writer, she only wrote 2 novels and 2 travel memoirs, one set on Kalymnos, one set on Hydra. And then when they got back to Australia, he had, you know, these years of terrible illness. He was in hospital for 8 months at a time. They had 3 children. And she, rather amazingly, became an essayist for the Sydney Morning Herald. And she became the most read essayist in Australia and had this massive following, which was an incredible achievement. But it meant that every week this woman who didn't write easily, she really kind of had to be in the right place, was having to turn out something. And it meant that her own work just did get pushed completely to one side. And the great tragedy is that she didn't live to write what the great books that she would have done. I mean, I feel absolutely certain she would have written some wonderful novels had she survived.
Yeah. I think one of the really tragic ironies that comes across very, very clearly in the book is around this notion of their writing relationship, because unlike most writers, they do have a writing relationship. They co-write novels together, and in the 50s they write 3 novels together. But then by the time we get to 1960, which is the year where you've set most of the novel, Johnston is contemplating, more than contemplating, drafting his latest work, and he's aiming against her. So this collaborative relationship has become one where he's targeting his co-writer and his wife. It's extraordinary.
Yes. Well, Jean-Claude Maurice, who was mentioned in that last reading, was someone who she lampooned in her first memoir, which was written in their first year on Hydra. But she did have an affair with Jean-Claude Maurice. You know, how that worked when she'd lampooned him so cruelly. You know, she described him as a little curly dog on heat in Peel Me a Lotus. And then, you know, 2 years later, lo and behold, she falls for the little curly dog on heat. And you know, the literary attention that's been lavished on him is he appears in 3 novels, one, her memoir, but then he appears in 2 books by George Johnston. And the book that came out in 1960 is called Closer to the Sun. And it has him, I think, called Achille Moulier, and he is having an affair with the narrator's wife. And then when they were back, which was all right, because actually that novel didn't do terribly well. But when they went back to Australia, George Johnston had written an autofiction called My Brother Jack, which did enormously well. I mean, it was made into a 10-part TV series, which Cliff wrote the screenplay for. It was a massive bestseller. It won the biggest literary award in Australia, the Miles Franklin Prize. And the second volume of that was called Clean Straw for Nothing, and was centered on their time on Hydra, and was absolutely about the effect on him of being a jealous husband, of being impotent, and of suspecting his wife, who he was furious with, not only because she, you know, was still sort of sexually active, but also because she was in good health. So he was sort of furious every time she climbed to the top of the mountain to see the sunset, or when she went for a lovely midnight swim. He was furious, just furious, eaten up with jealousy. And it was on the eve of publication of that second book, which detailed this Jean-Claude Maurice character and her affair, that she suicided. And I think the difference between the 2 books, which were sort of 5 years apart, was that the first one didn't have an enormous audience, but the second one, not only were they back in Australia and he had a huge readership, but she was also a household name. So the sort of shame that was about to descend upon her was massive.
Why do you think he did it? Was he trying to destroy her writing career? Was he trying to destroy their relationship? I mean, why did he do it?
It's really hard to know why. I doubt very much that he meant for her to kill herself. And I don't think she meant to kill herself either. I think that was a sort of culmination of a drunken fright, and was a cry for help, and she was deeply depressed. But she, you know, she could have been saved. Anyone could have walked into the room, and I think it was genuinely a cry for help, but the cry wasn't heard. Why did he do it? I think he was very jealous of the idea that she was going to live and he was going to die. I mean, he wrote that, you know, the second volume was written, you know, a year before he died, and he managed to sort of write half of the next one of the trilogy. And I know you've read them all, but you know, he was also a very, very good writer, but I think he was often trying to work things out about himself. And the book, the second one of the trilogy, does begin with, I need to understand my marriage, was what he was trying to work out. But he definitely sort of slightly twisted things in that, you know, he was clearly very twisted by this point, I think, to make it appear that it was the stress that she caused him that killed him. Well, that's not true. Yeah. It was the TB that he'd contracted as a war correspondent in China, you know, made much worse by the fact that he didn't give up drinking and he didn't give up smoking. And the other thing that he did was on Hydra, he would take a break from the antibiotics because he didn't realize that by doing that, his body was going to build up a resistance. So in fact, all of these things were things that he did to himself. They weren't things that Charmy and Cliff did to him, but he was clearly very, very angry with her.
One of the interesting aspects of the book is the way in which the relationship between these 2 writers, although I think it's the most complex and the most detailed relationship that you sketch in the novel. Actually, it seems to be part of a pattern that you see elsewhere in the book, in which all of the women, talented people in their own rights, are playing supporters and the support acts to their apparently more creative partners, male partners. This is true of course, of Axel Jensen with Marianne, but then it becomes true in embryo form of Marianne and Leonard Cohen, Robin Wallace and her husband Bim, but also your fictional hero, Erica, and her boyfriend as well. There is a pattern here that clearly interests you.
Yes, well, it really interested me, that the idea of, we think of the 60s as this time where there was, equality, and it was also marvelous, and everyone had these great relationships, and women were suddenly, having a great time. But that didn't start until the pill became available, because actually the thing that was really, really hampering these women was the fact that they could become pregnant. And so, they were really having to sort of throw their lot in with men. And that meant supporting the men, because the men were able to earn a living, and they were all, they were dependent on the men, because they didn't yet have equality, because until they were able to control their own ability to not get pregnant, there was no equality. And the world didn't really change for another 10 years. Really, the 60s happened in the 70s. We now know that. But in 1960, these women were not equal to the men. And that really interested me. I mean, it really interests me that there are people I know who are not that much older than me, who absolutely remember a time when they couldn't get a mortgage or rent a flat or do anything, get a hire purchase agreement, without either their father or a husband signing the documents. I mean, that is extraordinary. It's in our living history that women who are friends of mine remember these times. So yes, they were all really stuck.
I think there are two particular points in the novel which sort of draws this out, because you're suddenly aware of this massive chasm between theory and practice. So Germaine Greer's The Female Eunuch is passed around in the 1970s chapter, and in the 1960s chapters, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex goes round from person to person, but not really having an impact on the behavior of certainly of the men in this community.
No, it was only, I mean, they all loved to talk about it, but it was entirely theoretical. I mean, it wasn't yet something that the women could not make any demands on the men could make plenty of demands on the women. And it is it interested me because it is, the living recent history, of lots and lots of women that I know and admire. Yeah.
But you do see some hope for Erica, I think. I mean, Charmian particularly befriends her in order to sort of make her into an embryo or model feminist, living the possibilities that Simone de Beauvoir is outlining.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Charmian does, in the 1960 section of the novel, Charmian constantly, poor Erica is 18, and Charmian is constantly telling her, don't get pregnant. Don't throw your lot in with this terribly dull boy. Do something else. And then we see her in 1970 when she comes back to the island. She's brought a copy of The Female Eunuch to give to Marianne, who, of course, Marianne is a sort of lost cause in a way, because she has a child and she is dependent on these men, and she's rather, she has a sort of terrible tunnel vision towards each man that she's with. Whereas Erica, we see there's a moment when there's a sort of motif in the novel, which is from something that Leonard Cohen always talked about. When asked about Hydra and Marianne, he would say, "Oh, sweetness, sweetness everywhere, and on my desk a fresh gardenia and a little sandwich." And so that runs as a sort of motif, and we see from the 1970s onwards, Erica is putting the gardenia and the little sandwich, and it's on her own desk. And we see her, she gets a job at Spare Rib, and then she works at Time Out, and then eventually she writes her own books, and she's not doing it. She's not doing these things for a man. She's doing these things for herself. And I think that was, a way of showing how the times had changed, because Erica was now in charge of her own destiny. Erica was able to get the pill. Erica was able to not serve a man, and to do her own work. And so, yes, it showed that progression.
In the wonderful passage that you've just read us, as well as Charmian explaining something of the very complex history of their relationship, the relationship between her and her husband, and the relationship with Jean-Claude, you also sense that there is a mystery or an enigma attracting her to your fictional hero, Erica. Could you just say a little bit more about that? Because I think it really, this enigma binds the novel together. You sense there's something there, and it's only towards the end that you, as the author, reveal it to us.
Yeah. Should I reveal it now, or is it?
No, I don't think you should. But maybe just say a little bit about what you think is going on in Charmian's mind as she sees ghosts.
Yes. Well, when in that passage where Charmian stops talking and changes the subject, and she does talk about, how she feels that George is no longer the man she married, which indeed it is something that she wrote in a letter. But she has a secret, Charmian, and it's very much to do with what we've been talking about. It's very hard to talk about this without giving it away. It's a secret that benefits Erica's need to have Charmian give her attention. That's a huge clue as to what her secret might be.
I think it's a good clue, but if it's a clue that gets you some more readers, then I think we should leave it as a mystery. But it is at the heart, I think, of the pacing of the novel, and certainly I didn't know enough myself about her history, and particularly the history of what happened after her death,
yes.
To understand what was underlying this. And I found it really convincing when you revealed what was going on here, and very moving as well.
Yes, I mean, I still think about these Charmian most days. I mean, I have just reread. There's a wonderful biography. If anyone reads the novel and then they want to read more, someone wrote a biography. Nadia Wheatley wrote a huge, it's nearly 800-page biography, and I've just reread it for pleasure. And it was actually rather wonderful, sort of after all the work on the book, to just read it and sort of be back in her world. And at the moment, I'm rereading both volumes of memoir, because I'm writing they're being reissued, which is because what I really hoped would happen, and it's happened so fast. And the wonderful Muswell Press are bringing out both volumes of the memoirs, and I'm writing the introduction. So it's a lovely sort of thing to be doing right now, back in her world, reading those books again, and trying to sort of work out why she's had such a sort of effect on me, which she really has.
And that really comes across in the writing. I mean, you, for those of us who haven't had the pleasure of finding her novels or her autobiographical volumes, even in secondhand copies, you create a very, very powerful image of her. You also, and this summer where few of us were able to get to Greece, really recreate the Greek summer, really recreate either, and a very strong sense, not just of place, but also of time. So the third passage that we've chosen will give people who've not read the novel just some sense of your lyrical voice, which I think is really enchanting.
Thank you.
Manos steers the boat closer to the island. The smells of wild thyme and diesel and the rhythmic thumping become so soporific we all fall into a lull. Now we are beyond Palomidas. The shoulders of the island grow sparse. We pass the sheer cliff where the old people used to go to die. Sometimes, Manos says, in a basket which just rolled off the edge, sometimes by leaping. They'd say to their family, "Why waste a good basket?" Soon a landscape that includes the occasional olive tree or pine gives way to nothing but bold, muscular rocks. It's hypnotic watching the striations and marblings pass us by, dusty bronze and dusty grey and ironstone where sudden great rivers of malachite green and butcher's red flow. We pass Pirate's Cave, one with an old hermit who guards its entrance, and Manos tells us the story of the pink chapel in a bay where red wine is used to mix the whitewash in remembrance of an ancient wrecking of a wine boat when all the souls along with the barrels of wine were miraculously washed ashore. You can't help but gasp when you see Bisty Bay for the first time. It's a perfect horseshoe with steep pine forests rising up around a jewel box of pebbles. The water flashes blue as a million kingfishers. When you look down into it from the boat, it's rippling with gold, the clearest water in the whole of Greece. Closer to the beach, the reflections of pine trees stipple it with scarab green iridescence. We are met by Lena, who comes splashing and cheering, wearing little more than plaited seaweed that hangs in tendrils from her waist. Hey, hey, ahoy there! A white shell flies on a cord between her brown breasts as she throws up her arms to catch the rope. The others come scootling from the trees when they hear her shout. It's like being greeted by a particularly golden gang of savages as they wade towards us to help carry the supplies ashore. The boys have all grown beards. Ivor wears nothing but a crown of feathers in his yellow hair. One of the Dutch girls has painted petals around her nipples. Bim's foot barely touches the shore before he's shedding his shorts. Albin and Ivor have been out spearfishing, and their catch of 3 lugubrious-faced grouperfish are being prepared by Goran, who has paused beneath the pine trees with his knife in the block to scribble in his notebook. He is crouched over, transfixed by the fallen fish scales that glitter up at him from among the cross-hatching of pine needles. A couple of hammocks hang between the trees, and the sailmaker has done a good job with the tents, which have kept out the overnight rain and are now steaming in shafts of sunlight beneath the pines. Albin shows us around. There's a neat stack of logs for their fire and a pole roped between trees for gymnasium. At the shore, the water barrel and the wine casks are kept cool beneath a wet mound of towels. Albin reckons they'll stay all summer if they don't get thrown off.
Fantastic. Well, for me, Polly, that was my Greek summer because I didn't manage to get out there. So reading the novel brought the smells and the sounds and the splashing of the Greek summer very powerful into my study here in Tooting. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Passages like that and the passages around the community of writers made me think that this is a mammoth research exercise. My last question before I let in questions from the audience is about your research. How long did it take, and where other than the island did you do your research?
Well, oh, woe is me, I had to go to Egypt.
Yes.
So yes, I went. I knew I had to go in every month of the year and spend time there. I was sort of magical things happened actually. The second time I went, which was in October. So I did the research after I'd been in 2014 and into Charmian, and then I went in October 2016, November 2016, October to November, and while I was there, Leonard Cohen died, which felt, incredibly sad, but did release me because until then I didn't know how I was going to write this period. I felt completely hamstrung by having to have Leonard Cohen in it. I thought for a while that maybe he could just walk past whistling, and that he never needed to speak at all. And the other thing that happened was I spent quite a lot of time on roads, and there's hardly anyone there at that time of year, and we were walking through the lanes and suddenly someone shouted our names, and we sort of looked around, and it was someone we knew from Rhodes, who had a tiny little restaurant on Rhodes and who'd opened one on Hydra. And we went into this restaurant, which to talk to him, I don't think it was even open, but he cooked us some pasta, and there was one other person in there. And he happened to be the person who lived in Charmian Cliff's house. And so we chatted, and he said, when he heard what I was doing, he said, oh, I live in the house of a writer. And I said, no, not Charmian Cliff. And he said, yes. And so we became firm friends. And in fact, I wrote part of the novel in his house. So yes, so I spent a lot of time on Hydra. I still, as soon as it's the first place I'm going to, as soon as I feel it's safe to travel. I also went to Kalymnos because I wanted to see where they had been. And that was fascinating, actually. I loved Kalymnos. And yes, and then a lot of research with academic libraries, and and just reams and reams of things from the people who'd been there, and very, very close readings of Leonard Cohen's poetry, which was actually very helpful, and listening to nothing but Leonard Cohen songs for the years I was working on this book.
It's
but
not the most terrible
it's
research project, is
I have to
it?
say it was just it was a dream. I mean, lucky me, sort of falling on this. I mean, it was a gift. I mean, lovely.
Does she have an archive? Is there an archive of her writings in Australia
It's not so much an archive. It is archived, but it's all under the name of her husband, which is, again, you think, oh, that is quite significant. And yes, you can access things, but it's quite haphazard, it has to be said. I'm not sure how complete it is. Annoyingly, one of the last things they did was they wrote a book called The Serpent in the Rock, which was their book about Hydra, because they sort of noticed, they thought, well, there isn't really a great book about Hydra to do with any sort of myths and places and, all of the things. And so they wrote this book, and at that time, in 1963, no one bought it. And there isn't a copy of that anywhere. And, oh, I would love to find that typescript, but it sadly doesn't seem to exist.
Oh, that's a shame. But though once researchers start getting interested in archives, all sorts of things can turn up.
Yes.
And let's hope that one of the things that your novel does is generate real enthusiasm, both amongst the publishers. You've already told us that Charmian's books are coming back into print, which is fabulous. But also one would expect people will be picking up aspects of this for their own research projects, because your hold on the imagination and the period is so strong that I'm sure you will inspire people to do some research.
Oh, I hope so. It would be wonderful. I mean, I can't get enough of it even now.
Right, let's go over to audience questions. Thank you to the audience for being patient. We've got a good handful of questions, all of different sorts, actually. Let me start with a question from Igor Cordello. Have you already sold film adaptation rights? Is there any possibility to film a movie based on Theatre for Dreamers?
Yes, well, that is all in hand, actually. It's not signed, but there's a fantastic, I wish I could tell you all. There's a fantastic director and screenwriter who are all both working together at the moment and in discussions with a production company. So everything crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be, I'd love it, of course.
Fantastic. Well, you'd have to be on set to help out.
I mean, of course.
Fantastic. Second question from Blair Crichton. Hello, Poppy. I'm enjoying Theatre for Dreamers very much. I was in the area in the 60s, loved the atmosphere and the light. Planned to go to either recently, but didn't make it this time. Thank you also for your lockdown sessions, which were wonderful. Question from Faith. As an aspiring writer and journalist myself, what would you say is the biggest challenge or obstacle you've had to overcome in your writing career? So a general question.
My biggest challenge, taking the time to do, I have 4 children. Sometimes it feels quite selfish to go and shut myself away. That's no longer a problem. So I had a period of 10 years where I didn't write a book at all. I hope that I'll never have a period of 10 years where I don't write a book. I mean, I'm never happier than when I'm sitting in my shed in my imaginary world talking to my imaginary friends. So it's about just making some time to do it, I think, and I found it really helpful to block out time in the family diary. So there'd be things like, so and so to a party, so and so to this club, and then I would put 2 till 5 Polly working, and actually putting it in the diary was really helpful, I think. Yeah, it's just about blocking out time.
Fantastic. a good question, which is in a way a follow-on question from Maya Klein, who says, when or how did you know your amazing novel was finished and that you could let it into the world? I think that's a good question.
Yes, that is a good question. Well, I suppose when I finished working with my editor at the publishing company, and I'm a bit more like George Johnston than Charmian, really. I do like to sort of share. I read aloud to my husband, you know, as I'm going along. Often, you know, I'll say, "Oh, can I just read you the chapter I wrote this week?" How do you know it's finished? Yes, I couldn't really. I mean, it just did. You know, you type the words "the end" and it feels that it is the end. I think there comes a point where you're rewriting too much and you're taking away more than you're adding. And I think it's about, you have to recognize that moment.
Had you always intended to bring the story forward through your lead hero, Erica? Was that was present from the start?
Yes.
Your structure was there from the start?
I always knew what the last chapter was. In fact, it turned out to be 3 chapters, but I always knew how it was going to end. I mean, it had a progression, because I did want to tell the story of what had happened to both Marianne and the children and Charmian and George. So yes.
This is a rather different sort of question, but again, an interesting one. This is from Ella Wiley, who asks, who says, "Hi Polly, I'm curious about how classical Greek values still affect life in Greece. I loved reading about your characters practicing rituals for Apollo in your book. I study Greek myth at university, and I'm curious to hear about the significance of Greek myth today."
Oh gosh, I don't think I'm the person. I think you could answer this, John, better than I could. I stole a lot of the sort of pagan ceremonies from Charmian. I mean, these are things that she writes about, and I just reimagined them and loved it. I mean, and then went and did some of these things in order to write about it. But I find that a very, very difficult question to answer.
You do, where you introduce the rituals, I think it's quite fun, because it's very clear that the characters who are playing around aren't expert, and they're having a fun time with ancient Greece, and I think that comes across very clearly.
Yes, I mean, one of the things was I wrote the welcoming of Apollo part of the book, where they climb Mount Eres and they wait for the sunrise, and I'd written it really from my imagination. I mean, I'd already been spending time in the sort of foothills, but after I'd written it, we did get up at 4 a.m. and we did climb the mountain and we did wait for the sunrise. And actually, this is how great one's imagination can be. I didn't change a word. It was just, oh, it's exactly how I imagined it. Oh, thank goodness. But and it did feel like it had some sort of root back to ancient time. I mean, these things do feel great. So I hope we never lose touch with these things.
I think that's impossible. One final question from me, and then there is one last question which I'm going to pick out from the audience questions. Ancient Greece, modern Greece, well, there is a living Greece, and it's great to hear, you told me a couple of weeks ago, that the novel is going to be translated and published in Greece. I think you said next year.
Yes.
How do you think this is going to land in Greece? The Bohemian community on Hydra, what are your hopes or fears for the Greek edition?
Oh, well, I think on Hydra, everyone reads English, so they probably, you know, I know a lot of people there now, and they've read it, and I suppose I have to take I could take the temperature of it from the people I know there who've given me a double thumbs up. So I hope that continues. I mean, it's interesting at the moment because the Greek translator is sending me all sorts of queries, and that's sort of fascinating because there are, you know, things I haven't thought about, and she's raised some really interesting points, but nothing that I would have to go back and redo, thank goodness. But there was a moment when when I was first in touch with the translator, and I thought, oh no, this could be disastrous, but it's all right. It's all right.
This process is very interesting. I could spend another hour that we don't have talking about the translation process. A lot of us in the academic world are interested in this, and the way in which novelists work with their translators and the points at which they let the translators into their novels varies widely. But you've obviously had a good experience.
A very good experience, but actually it was fascinating because I said to the publisher, oh, do put the translator in touch with me, and the translator said that it seemed that didn't normally happen, and it makes perfect sense to me that we should try and have a dialogue, because of course once we were in touch, she had all sorts of interesting questions, and so I'm enjoying it very much. Actually.
Well, I look forward to seeing it, because it's always fun to see a novel that you've read come out in Greek. So I will certainly look.
We have things like there's a cat, and of course the English version, the cat is called Cato. Well, how do you do that?
Yes, yeah.
How do you keep both cat and the Roman? I mean, it's yeah. So we're working on that at the moment.
Fantastic. Final question, also a bit of a follow-on. This is again from Ella Wiley. So what's in process? Is there another book in store for us in the near future?
Well, I mean, at the moment, I'm really enjoying writing these introductions to Charmian's books. I haven't got my next book sort of bubbling away. I feel still very much in this one. It's a very unusual situation. I wonder whether it's to do with the current situation we're all in. You know, that the last time that I felt free and easy was when I was sort of writing this book, and then I wrote various articles to support the publication. And, you know, I feel like I'm sort of still in it. And until I've sort of gone right through this process, I don't think that the doors are open to let anything else in, really. I mean, I've written a song that came out of this book, one song, which actually I always knew as soon as I wrote the words. And in fact, it was in that reading. It was, yes, I have ghosts, not all of them dead, something that Charmian says. And I know this will sound a little crazy, but I was walking along one day on Hydra, and I heard her voice say it in my ear, and as soon as I heard it, I got this chill, and I thought, well, that's in the book, but that's a song, because I absolutely related to that thought about being haunted by people who were still living, but where there'd been some sort of rupture. So it would be, so that at least that has happened, and I think that song is out there now. And because we were in lockdown, that wasn't completed. Because there was no chance of getting the backing singers in, and there was no chance of it being finished. And then lo and behold, my daughter, who was in lockdown with us, turned out she had a beautiful blend and could sing the backing vocals. And so it happened, and it's sort of rather wonderful. But that was something that was born out of this book, and maybe there's another one.
I do like to hear that you are still haunted by your characters and by the novel itself. And it does suggest to me that there must be all sorts of follow-ons from this set of people and their relationships and their creativity.
Yes. Yes, I mean, my dream would, I keep thinking, I can't write another novel with Charmian in it, but that would be, that's where I am at the moment. I still do sort of feel very much in touch with those characters. I mean, I'll have to stop. I'll have to give them up.
Well, I think you're being captivated by them comes across really strongly in the novel, and has come across in the last hour and 10 minutes. Thank you. We're afraid at the end of our time. I think we could continue for another few hours. You've been incredibly open and candid and really engaging. I've really enjoyed talking with you about a novel that certainly lived with me as I read it over the summer. So I do hope it goes into film production, and that we get a chance to see it on the screen. But I think it works as a book first and foremost. The characters live with us, the sense of time, the sense of place. So not only a big thank you from me and from the League and from the audience, but also many congratulations. It's a really successful novel.
Oh, John, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. It's been lovely talking to you, and thank you to everyone out there. Thank you. Have we frozen?
So much. Before I close things down, we've frozen. We are just, let me just see if I can just bring this up again, because I said at the start that I would let everyone know how to contact us. If you aren't on our mailing list and would like to be, please just drop us a line at info@anglo-hellenicleague.org. To join us as a member, you can find out more about the organisation at our website, which is just www.anglo-hellenicleague.org. Please join us, please get on our mailing list. As you've already heard, we've got more events coming up, and we really look forward to welcoming you back to us again. So final thanks to Polly for a really wonderful talk, and thank you to the audience for joining us here tonight.
John,
Thank
there's
you.
a question about the recording and whether it will be available.